Hey everyone, welcome back. We always appreciate you sending interesting stuff our way. And this week, you guys really outdid yourselves
Though,
sharing that blog post, the one by Frederick Griffin from GH Management Partners.
right, right.
And it's over at, just in case anyone wants to check it out themselves, https://www.ghmanagementpartners.com/Griffin Hill Business Stocks. It's under their Think Pieces section.
Yep.
Now, this one's all about tariffs on Chinese imports. And we thought, you know what, let's do a deep dive on this for our listeners, especially for those of you who are American consumers or business owners.
Yeah, it's a big deal for sure.
I mean, what could the impact of these tariffs actually be? Well, Griffin's blog lays it out pretty clearly, and we're going to try to pull out the most important insights for you.
Absolutely. I think what Griffin does really well is he breaks down this complex topic into digestible pieces
Right.
so we can understand how these tariffs can really shift things around in the American economy.
Okay, so let's jump right in. The blog starts by listing the main things, the categories of goods that the U.S. gets from China.
And Griffin has 8 key areas. First up, and I think this is the one that hits closest to home for most people, is electronics.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Smartphones, computers, TVs, you name it.
It's everything.
We're surrounded by electronics, and a lot of them, well, they come from China.
And it's not just the sheer quantity, right?
Yeah.
It's that China has really become the go-to for electronics manufacturing. They've spent decades building these super specialized supply chains and entire ecosystems for making this stuff.
It's not something you can just pick up and move overnight.
Exactly. So when you slap tariffs on this sector, it gets messy. Prices go up for consumers, and the whole tech industry feels the squeeze.
So that's electronics, massive category. Then Griffin goes on to machinery and electrical equipment, which is another huge one.
Yeah, think like industrial machinery, components for those electronics we were just talking about, even stuff like household appliances.
Oh, okay, got it. So from there, we shift gears a little bit. He talks about furniture and bedding.
Right, right. I mean, seriously, how much of our furniture comes from China? Sofas, beds, everything.
It's a lot, yeah. Then there's toys and sporting goods.
Ah, yeah, toys. Gotta be a ton of toys.
Think about the last time you bought a toy for a kid, or even some new workout gear. Chances are China was involved somewhere along the line.
Probably, yeah. And then, of course, there's what we wear, textiles and apparel, clothes, fabrics, all that stuff.
Huge part of the fashion industry.
For sure. Next up is plastics and plastic articles, which is kind of a catch-all category, right?
Yeah, it's everything from the packaging your food comes in to those
Yeah.
plastic containers you use every day, and even industrial components.
I never really thought about it like that. Okay, so rounding out this picture, Griffin talks about vehicles and vehicle parts.
Yeah, so we might not be seeing tons of finished cars coming in from China,
Right.
but a lot of the parts that go into cars, whether they're assembled here in the U.S. or elsewhere, those parts often come from China.
Makes sense. And the final category, this one feels really important, is medical and pharmaceutical products.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're talking medical devices, supplies, even some of the raw materials that go into our medicines. It's kind of mind-blowing when you see it all laid out like that.
It really highlights how much we rely on Chinese imports across almost every part of our lives and the economy.
It's kind of overwhelming, actually.
And Griffin doesn't stop there. He takes this broad overview and then he zooms in on how these tariffs are playing out for specific American companies.
Okay, so he's getting into real-world examples here.
Exactly. He uses a report from Reuters to illustrate the consequences.
And this is where it gets interesting, because it's not just about abstract categories anymore. It's about actual businesses.
Right. So one of the companies he mentions is Boeing,
Boeing, the airplane manufacturer.
the one and only.
Okay, what about them?
Well, they're a huge exporter, right?
Yeah.
But because of these tariffs, their costs have gone up, especially when it comes to the planes they sell to China.
So these tariffs, they're not just about stuff coming into the U.S. They can hurt American companies trying to sell things abroad, too.
Exactly. It's a two-way street. And Boeing's a perfect example of how tariffs can backfire and end up hurting American businesses through retaliatory tariffs or just by making it more expensive to do business globally.
Got it. So it's more complicated than it seems at first.
Way more complicated.
Mm.
And then Griffin brings up Intel and Micron Technology.
Okay, those are big names in the tech world.
Yeah, major players in the semiconductor industry, which is, well, it's kind of the backbone of all things tech these days.
Everything runs on semiconductors.
And they're getting hit hard by these tariffs, too. What this really shows is how globalized the tech supply chain is and how disruptive tariffs can be. It slows down innovation and drives up costs for everyone.
So it's not just Boeing then, it's tech companies too.
And it's not just high-tech either. He also mentions Caterpillar and Deere & Co.
Oh, those are the big agricultural equipment manufacturers.
Exactly. And they're facing challenges because of these tariffs as well, which means American farmers who depend on that equipment, they're feeling the pain too.
Okay, so this is hitting American farmers in their wallets.
It is. Their operating costs go up, and that can have a ripple effect on the whole agricultural sector.
This is getting pretty serious.
Well, and here's the thing. Griffin makes a really important point about these company examples.
What's that?
He says, look, these tariffs aren't just some simple tax that gets paid at the border. It's not that straightforward.
Okay, so what happens then?
Well, these costs, they get absorbed in different ways by American companies. They might see their profits shrink, or they become less competitive globally, or, and this is the one we all feel, they raise prices for us, the consumers.
Ah, so that's how it comes back to us.
Exactly. And Griffin then dives deeper into 6 specific industries to show how these impacts play out in more detail.
Okay, so he's breaking it down even further.
He is. So first up is technology and electronics.
Makes sense, given everything we've been talking about.
And he specifically mentions Apple, Dell, and HP.
Those are huge companies.
They are, and because they rely so much on Chinese manufacturing, these tariffs put a lot of pressure on their profit margins.
Yeah, I can see that. So what do? Do they eat the cost, or do they raise prices for us?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it's not always a simple answer, because it's not just the final product, like your laptop or your phone, that gets hit with tariffs.
So there's more to it.
Yeah, a lot of the individual components inside those devices, those also come from China, and those are subject to tariffs too.
So it's like a double whammy.
It can be.
Ah,
And because the supply chain is so complex, it's not easy for these companies to just pick up and move their manufacturing somewhere else.
so they're kind of stuck.
In a way, yeah.
Now.
Okay, moving on. Griffin looks at the automotive sector.
Okay, cars.
Cars, trucks, you name it. He points out that even American automakers like GM and Ford, they get a lot of their parts from China.
Oh, I didn't realize it was that much.
It's significant. And those tariffs on imported parts, they directly increase manufacturing costs for these companies.
And that puts them in a tough spot, right?
It does. They either raise prices on their vehicles, which could make people buy less,
Hmm.
or they absorb the higher costs themselves, and that hurts their profits.
It's a lose-lose situation.
Pretty much. And then Griffin shifts to retail and apparel.
Okay, clothes shopping.
Yeah, and he focuses on the big players, Walmart, Target, Nike.
Those are familiar names.
They are. And they import massive amounts of clothing, shoes, home goods, all from China.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the key here is the scale, right? Even a small tariff percentage can add up to a huge cost increase when you're importing that much stuff.
Wow, so what do they do?
Well, it puts pressure on their pricing strategies. Do they try to keep prices the same and eat the cost? That could hurt their bottom line.
Right.
Or do they pass those increased costs along to us by raising prices on everyday items? It's a tough call.
It's not just about consumer goods either. Griffin also talks about agriculture, specifically how tariffs on parts for farm equipment are affecting things.
Yeah, we touched on this earlier with Caterpillar and John Deere.
Right, those companies are getting hit twice, aren't they?
They are. They might face tariffs on the equipment they're trying to sell to China,
Right.
and they're also paying more for the imported components they need to build that equipment here.
Ouch.
And those higher equipment costs, they trickle down to American farmers. It makes farming more expensive, which could eventually mean higher food prices for all of us.
So the ripple effect goes pretty far.
It does. Then Griffin moves on to healthcare and pharmaceuticals.
Okay, that's a big one.
Huge. He points out that medical device manufacturers and drug companies, a lot of them import components or raw materials from China.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And those tariffs, they increase their costs too.
And this is a sensitive area, right? Because higher costs for medical stuff, that could mean healthcare gets more expensive for everyone.
Exactly. It could affect how affordable medical equipment and medications are for hospitals, doctors, and patients.
So those tariffs could have a direct impact on people's health.
That's the concern. And finally, Griffin looks at the industrial and manufacturing sector as a whole.
Okay, so big picture stuff now.
He mentions companies like GE, Honeywell, and 3M.
Yeah, those are major players in the industrial world.
And these companies, they often rely on imports from China for specialized machinery and electrical equipment.
Right, the stuff that keeps their factories running.
Exactly. And those tariffs, they can disrupt their supply chains, make it more expensive to operate, and potentially even affect the prices of the industrial goods they produce.
And those goods are used by other businesses, so it just keeps going.
It's a chain reaction. And that's what Griffin really highlights.
Yeah, I'm seeing that now. It's not just about one industry or one company.
It's all connected. So Griffin then shifts gears a bit and asks us to think about something interesting.
Okay, what's that?
He asks, with prices potentially going up because of these tariffs, what are American consumers willing to cut back on?
So he's getting into how this affects our everyday choices.
Exactly. He's talking about how these big economic forces can play out in our personal lives.
Makes sense. So what does he say? What are we willing to give up?
Well, he suggests that when things start to get tight, people might prioritize their spending and cut back on what he calls more easily sacrificed things.
Okay, so stuff we can live without.
Right. And first on his list is consumer electronics.
You mean like the latest gadgets and stuff?
Exactly. Maybe we don't need to upgrade our phones every year, or we hold off on buying that fancy new gadget we don't really need.
Yeah, I can see that. What else?
Next up is fast fashion and apparel.
Oh, like those trendy clothes that go out of style quickly.
Exactly. Maybe we buy fewer clothes, but higher quality ones that last longer.
Or maybe we start looking for more stuff made in the US.
Yeah, that's a possibility. If domestic options become more competitive because of the tariffs, we might see a shift in that direction.
Interesting. What's next on the list?
Non-essential home goods and furniture.
Okay, so maybe we hold off on redecorating the living room.
Right, or we make our current furniture last a little longer.
Those are definitely things we can postpone.
They are. And then there's toys and recreational goods.
Kids' toys.
Yeah, and other stuff like that. We're probably not going to stop buying toys for kids altogether, but maybe we buy fewer or we choose less expensive options.
I get it. We focus on the essentials.
Yeah, exactly. And finally, he mentions luxury goods.
Ah, that's the high-end stuff.
Designer brands, expensive electronics, luxury cars, all that. Those are usually the first things to go when budgets get tighter.
Yeah, they're not necessities.
Exactly. And these categories, they all represent discretionary spending. Things we want, but don't strictly need.
So we can cut back on those when we have to.
Right. Now, Griffin contrasts these with essential goods, things like food, basic clothing, and healthcare.
The things we can't live without.
Exactly. And he says people are much less likely to cut back on these no matter what,
Makes sense.
because these are fundamental needs. And he also mentions some other ways consumers might adapt.
Like what?
Well, we might start looking harder for cheaper alternatives, whether that's from American companies if they can compete on price, or from other countries that aren't subject to the same tariffs.
So it could change where we buy things from.
It could. And this highlights how consumers can be pretty flexible when it comes to their spending habits.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
Not at all. There are ways to adjust. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Griffin's analysis, what do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that tariffs on Chinese imports are way more complex than they seem.
Absolutely. It's not just a simple tax.
It affects so many different industries and companies.
It does. Tech, automotive, retail, agriculture, even healthcare, they all feel the impact.
And ultimately, these changes could have a big impact on how we spend our money, whether we're running a business or just managing our household budget.
That's the key takeaway. And Griffin's final point in his blog is that understanding how these tariffs work and being able to adapt to the changing global trade landscape is crucial for everyone.
Staying informed like you're doing by listening to this, that's the first step.
It is. And this leads us to a final thought for you to consider. Knowing what we've talked about today, how do you think these changes might affect your own spending habits or business strategies? It's something we all need to think about as the global economy continues to shift.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening, everyone.
We'll see you next time.